Okay, so let's take a little bit closer look at the other conditions, categories, and definitions themselves. So um, you can think of these, see how they lay these out. So you can think of these as terminologies and definitions that might make for good multiple choice questions on your exam. So just make note of that. Again, as always, this is not a it's not a memorization exercise, but but I want you to have a familiarity with these terms. Obviously, these are general terms. You have a sense of what they mean, right? But I think it's good to have a sense of what the DSM, how the DSM defines these particular terms. It's not. I don't think you'll find them somehow radically unique from your general understanding of them, but just good to have that, just to make sure you sort of spend a little time on that, not just for the exam, but just to get a sense of it yourself. So what I tried to do, obviously, it's a long section of a whole lot of different terms, and so I tried to just call out some of the ones I thought might be most important that have sort of more detail in their definitions that might be useful to you. Um, and then just some general subcategories. Um, it's not for memorization, of course, and I think that these, if you're asked about these in the exam, you'll be pointed back to this section. But just have a familiarity with this stuff. I think will be helpful to you. So just some summary of some of the things I called out in the text lecture content. Um, so um, Relational problems is not clearly distinguishing the concept from abuse or neglect. Um, this is just how I see it. Doing a lot of couples work as part of my work. Um, Relational problems. People can have significant relational problems and have even significant discord and verbal arguments and significant emotional estrangement, but that's not necessarily abuse or neglect. Including how, not just how I understand abuse and neglect, but how the DSM defines abuse and neglect. So I think it gets a little confusing. I would not call a situation where there's violence or obviously it can get a little, hard to delineate between arguing and discord and psychological abuse. And I think that's why just, having a general understanding of how the DSM defines psychological abuse in this section is also worth just taking a, just sort of make sure you read over it in the book and feel like you're comfortable with how they explain it. But that's just for me. Relational problems are distinct from abuse or neglect. That's just my 2 cents on that. Okay. Um, so I just added a little bit so you see this is here under educational problems, it's in italics. So I just added a little bit more to that definition that just to me, what comes up in terms of educational problems, again, this is just from me. Lack of access to proper schooling. That can be, you don't, the state of the building, the physical structures of the school are so bad. And I'm saying that, so bad that it really interferes with the children's ability to learn. Um, Lack of access can be a lack of access to a brick and mortar school. You may have a young person who is being forced in some way or coerced in some way to only participate in school remotely, and that can be its own problem in terms of like that child or that young person only getting education through online and getting no in-person educational exposure. Okay, and there will be lots of different reasons why that might be, but I think that that's worthy of consideration when we want to talk about we'll talk about educational problems. Academic problems can be related to learning, health problems, inability to learn, social circumstances, got no food in the house, walking to school on an empty stomach. It can be hard to learn when you're starving. Okay. As maybe you've even seen that yourself. So, relational problems with school staff or school peers can also be an impediment to education and academic performance. So those are just some things that I've seen along the way that I added. Like, it's not there's no diss on the DSM. It's just, hey, I just threw that in there for your consideration. Okay. Um, so see, we have, the only thing I added under occupational problems, and I just called out because it's not, I don't recall it being called out specifically in the DSM itself, but abuse or neglect in a job, things like sexual harassment on a job, can be significantly, as no surprise, you guys know this can be significantly traumatic to a person. And you can have a client who presents to you where their primary problem is traumatic injury from abuse, workplace abuse. Okay, so I just added that in there. I don't think I added anything more here um, in the housing. I think was their how they listed it out was pretty comprehensive. And you may find stuff too. By the way, let me before we move on to that, you may like, well, there's a housing issue that I run into all the time at my field placement. Like, some of these things are shaped by your experience. So if you're like, hey, I've run into something that's not really called out here, that's good to know. Okay, and you share that with peers. You can share that in our yellow dig if that comes up as relevant for you. And that's why all these experiences are an important part of what you're doing in your social work journey. All right. I see I made some notes to myself. I think I meant to take out of there before I was recorded this about, I'll add a little bit more in recording. Um, Problems with social environment that can be widely encompassing. It's almost too general to me to put in there. But look, people can come in and what's happening in their social environment, either directly with them or around them, um, can be so significant that is the primary driver of their distress and functioning impairment. All right. Circumstances in personal history, like you've heard me say in different, in some of the earlier videos, that sometimes people come in and things are happening in their immediate time frame that are very distressing to them, and that may be coupled with a mental health problem or a substance use problem or both. Um, but that those current circumstances are also a significant driver. Likewise, people can come in with things from the distant past, and sometimes a very very distant past. Sometimes people come in with things that have happened to them, experiences that they've had that are decades old, but are dogging them from a psychological point of view and interfering with their health and their functioning in a way that is as if it happened yesterday. And sometimes I'm meeting with with someone for the first time, and they're describing something, that we'd fall, we'd categorize under trauma, and they're describing it as if it, sounds like it had happened very recently, and there as they describe it, and as you talk to them some more, you begin to realize, oh my goodness, this happened a very long time ago, but they're still experiencing it. Grief can be that way too, by the way, and I'll make sure I bring that up when we get to grief. But yeah, so people can be really dogged by things in a very direct way, and that could have been in a long, long distant past. So yeah, just a little bit more on circumstance and personal history. Um, let's see. Yeah, we talked about, so right. There's the bereavement, and just as I was saying, there bereavements like that. Sometimes I meet with someone and they're talking about a loss, and it sounds like you hear the client talking about it, and then just not just the words, but the emotion and the body language is going along with it, and you're like, wow, this sounds like it just happened. And then you begin to realize, oh my goodness, this happened a very maybe a few weeks ago, a few months ago, and sometimes it's a very very long years, and sometimes even decades ago. But that's how bereavement and trauma can be. If they haven't had good support, if they're dogged by other mental health or substance use or other physiological conditions, in addition to whatever the loss was that's connected to the bereavement or the traumatic experience. They don't have a lot of support in their lives. If they're burdened by a lot of social determinant or cultural identity stuff, that makes all those things make it harder to get yourself through bereavement. Okay. Um, just I think the only other thing here, you can read it, but I look, I don't like necessarily like hit the roof every time I see the word normal, but I think in this context, it really I don't think it's the right verbiage. Um, One of the things that I um, get a lot in my work are people who are grieving and struggling and having lots of distress and maybe all kind of symptoms of a number of different diagnosable conditions, but they're clearly in great distress and they're struggling to function in their social roles. And part of their struggle and part of their grief and part of their distress and functional impact comes from feeling like, why is this hitting me so hard? Why am I still dealing with this? Why am I still bothered by this? When do I get over? When am I supposed to get over this? Was I supposed to get over this already? Likewise, the nature of loss. Right? Sometimes people come in and they've lost a job or they've lost a pet, and their part of their struggle is like, how can I be struggling with it? How can I have such a reaction to this when there's all this going on in the world and people lose very close loved ones and horrible things are happening? And here I am, I can't get out of bed because I'm so affected by the loss of my pet, as an example. All right. So that's why I can react the way I do to the idea of normal there. And I think helping people understand that like a lot of this stuff, how people respond to grief is very individualized. And I'm sure you hear a lot of talk about the stages of grief. Oh, the stages of grief are, that's all bunk. And well, to me, I'll give you my 2 cents on it. It's not so much that the stages of grief themselves are bad. We need some kind of framework to look at something that can be very complicated and nebulous, like bereavement and grief. I think what I observe is that grief stages of grief don't follow linear stages. And people tend to jump around, and in terms of not jump around like voluntarily, but they're moving through different phases of grief, and they can feel. And one of the reasons why this is important is they can feel like they're like 80, and I'm just making this up, 80% along in the way of grief to what they see as 100%, and all of a sudden they feel like they're back to 20% along the way of their grief, and people can get really frustrated by it, and that can be a big part of their struggle. Anyway, uh, so that's one more thing on grief here, is that people can experience grief over a life change that is what I call socially celebratory, like a child leaving home to live independently, college, military service. And again, the part of the problem can be is that the person is like, why am I depressed? Why do I feel sad? Why am I having trouble getting out of bed? Why am I, like struggling not to cry in almost every social circumstance I'm in, when it's just my daughter went off to college and I should be thrilled for her, right? So just understanding that, the bereavement is a lot more than just, losing a loved one, which is awful and significant. But there can be a lot more to it, in terms of losses than just those things. Okay. I need to read the spirituality thing. Um, uh, religion can be a protective factor or a risk factor. Lots of people and even students talk about how in our program talk about how faith has been an essential part of their self-care plan and their journey in social work in a positive way, and that's wonderful, right? Other people have a very different experience with organized religion and gets extrapolated to even faith, right? And of course, terrible things can happen in those things, as well as wonderful things can happen in those social structures.